Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te rana rawa, ko airana te whakapaparana mai, ko whainga roa Raglan, te kāinga, ko Kate McKegg tōku ingoa. Thank you for your lovely welcome, Karinia, and your karakia to start our day. Yeah, I'm Kate, and I'm looking forward to today sharing a bit of our evaluation stuff with you today, and hopefully there's something useful and inspiring for you. And I'll hand over to Rach.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you, kia ora, Karinia, for your karakia this morning. And welcome to you all here this morning. I just acknowledge this is our second go at this session. We had a bit of COVID interruption last time, so well done to you all for making this rescheduled session. So Kate and I, we're going to tag team this morning, and I'm going to share with you, share my screen. This is the terrain that we want to discuss today. I'll put it on a slideshow. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. So our terrain today is getting to value, putting the value in evaluation. How can we know what good looks like? This is what we're going to be covering. We're going to talk about what makes something evaluative and the difference between what is often done around evaluation and what is deeper and stronger evaluation. We're going to talk about writing good questions, evaluative questions, to frame and guide your evaluation approach. And we're going to share a process to answer those questions to help you get to what good looks like. And we're going to illustrate those with some examples for you. So the aim today is for you to leave with three things. One is clarity on what it is you need to evaluate in your space. What kind of questions you need to ask, what you need to know in relation to that, and a process to respond to those. As we go along, if you have questions, please, or comments, wonderings, just please put them in the chat and Kate or I will endeavour to pick them up. So what is evaluation? It is how we get to worth, significance, merit, what good looks like. You can think of it in this way: E for evidence, evidencing value in order to take action. And it's about really providing well-reasoned, evidenced answers to good evaluative questions to create social change and to learn. Much of what is called evaluation actually is describing what is going on. It's more in the, what did you do? Who was involved? How did it go? Often these are the things that funders are asking for, actually. Whether the outcomes you were seeking to achieve showed up or not, what are the things that you're learning? However, to get to the evaluative part, we really want to get into the so what, not just what you did, but, well, how good was it? What difference did it make? And also, what does that mean for us going forward? So to get to the evaluative part, we're looking for what was valuable, to what extent did we achieve our outcomes, how good were those outcomes, what's their value of the changes or progress made, and how do we know that? And what does that tell us for what we need to do next? So if you look at these questions here on the left, it'd be interesting to see whether you resonate with, are these the kinds of things you normally ask in terms of evaluation? Is this what you tend to share? Is it more in the kind of, well, what did we do? How much? What outcomes came up? What was good? What went well? What was challenging? What are we learning? How often do you really get into this terrain on the right? So to what extent did we meet our outcomes? How valuable were they? who benefited, how well did we do in terms of the quality of the work? Was it really worth it? Was it good value for money? And what should we do as a result? So we're going to, shortly, we're going to actually ask you to come up with some evaluative questions in terms of what it is that you're trying to get to the bottom of. So here's an example of a framework that takes you through this process. And in the next session, on the 23rd, we're going to actually look at some useful tools and processes for each of these three areas. So the monitoring side of things, what are we doing? The evaluative side, the so what, and the learning. So in terms of this monitoring, evaluation, learning, or MEL framework, on the monitoring side, you want to know what are the needs of our communities, the people that we're here to support or serve, the places, what are we trying to achieve, and then how are we doing that? With the evaluative side, you're looking to develop evidence sources for what actually happened, what changed for who, to what extent, what was important and valuable, and how well are we doing in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And with the learning side, you're really wanting to dive into not just what was good, what wasn't, but what is it that is making the change that we're trying to achieve? What else are we learning? And how are we going to apply what we're learning? Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Rach. Okay, so this is just a quick 5 minutes for each of you to just take a moment and on your own, write a set of evaluative questions for something that you want to evaluate. So if you recall, Rach showed and talked you through the difference between a descriptive question, a what question, and that's what we've been talking about, is that monitoring what, to the so what, the evaluative question, which is more asking questions about, as you can see here, how well, how valuable, overall, how sustainable. So an evaluative question taps into the value that's going on. It taps into the extent of something going on. The answer to an evaluative question is not 10% or yes or no. The answer to an evaluative question is something like, we did really well on these things, but not so well on these other things. And here's the evidence that we have that demonstrates that. So you can see the answer to an evaluative question is a bit more complex and goes a bit deeper. So we thought we'd give you 5 minutes just to think about something that you want to evaluate or that you might currently be evaluating. Identify that program or project or your plan or your initiative, and jot down a few evaluative questions that you think you would like to answer about that thing, that program, that project, that initiative. Any questions or that you might have, pop them in the chat, and we can answer them after this 5 minutes. So we'll just give you some quiet time now to just see if you can have a go at writing some of those evaluative questions for yourself.
I can't see the chat, so if there's anything coming up there, and just encourage you, if you've got any queries, put them in there.
Yeah, we'll just give you another minute, and then please feel free to comment on how you found that. Was that a different kind of questioning for you? Is there anything you're struggling with in writing those questions? What does it raise for you? What questions, what other things does it raise for you in terms of how you might actually answer the questions? Yeah, anything that comes up for you as you write those questions.
Maybe we'll just pause there and see if there are any.
Feel free to put your hand up as well. We've got a couple of minutes left, so we can answer some questions. If you don't want to put it in the chat, put your hand up, ask a question.
It was a bit of a light bulb for me quite a long time ago. I realised that a lot of the evaluation that I was part of was actually more descriptive. It wasn't getting to, you know, what's valuable about this, how good is it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Valerie.
We're going to be getting to that soon, that very issue.
Yeah. Yeah. So the rating of their feelings on a scale is a great way of getting a different sense of the range of feelings that these kids have got. Yeah. So you can get a sense of how many kids are right at the top, you know, feeling wonderful about what you're doing, and how many are not. And so that's a great example of an answer to a question that's not just a, what did we do? Was it good? Yes, no. It's more, how well are the kids responding? How well is it? How good is it for them? And how do we know how many and for whom? So getting a slightly more complex picture. So yeah, we're just about to get into the kinds of tools that we need to get deeper on those value questions. Yeah, but it is hard. It is much harder to go into the depth. But I guess if you go away with nothing else, I mean, one of the things that Rachael started with at the beginning was talking about value. And we quite often get when we think about evaluation, I think lots of people often think about measurement. They often think about measuring stuff, which is not unimportant, but it's not the point. The point of evaluation is to think about the value of things. And how is it that we're going to evidence that value? And so, yeah, if you go away with nothing else from today, then hopefully that's a cool part of this. Yeah.
And when you think about what's important and what creates social change, it's often around mindsets and what people think and feel. So finding ways to get to those is really crucial. And it's a matter of both and, isn't it, Kate? Having the kind of quantitative numbers, you know, and the more qualitative information. Okay.
And not leaping to that first. So we start with the value. What do we mean? Whose value? Anyway, okay. I think it's over to you, Rach. Or is it me?
I think it's,
oh, no, it's me.
I'm just
it's
trying
me.
to. Aha, here we go.
It's me. So here we go. This is what we were just talking about. So I guess what we were saying before is, and Rach has talked about her experience, and it was my experience as well. When I first started doing this evaluation stuff many moons ago, a lot of evaluation stops at the descriptive stuff, the what so. So what we're doing, how many, we might have some idea about who we're working with and who we're reaching, but it often starts at that what so. And often some of the judgments that we make about how well we're doing and what's been good aren't necessarily based and grounded in a clear understanding of what value really means to the people that we're working with either. So the question is about getting to value and the value that we are creating for the people that we're working with. So we need to have that step in the middle is how do we assess, how do we create a framework, how do we create a shared understanding of what quality and value actually mean in our context, so that we can answer the so what questions about how valuable or important or high quality or worthwhile something really is. And it's not just based on what we think. It's not just based on my opinion. It's actually grounded in a really thorough understanding of what value means. And that's the crux of evaluation. So how do we get to there? There are some, there's a well-trodden path that's becoming more and more conscious for people, more people that we work with, and over time we're slowly, gradually helping people see that there are some steps we can use and some tools to get to that deeper value proposition. So first of all, step one is to clarify what it is that you're evaluating, and that might be you might develop a theory of change here, or a logic model, or there are ways and tools for clarifying what is it that we're evaluating, because we can't drink the ocean. We've got to put some boundaries around what this thing is that we're doing, and often the things we're doing are really complex, so just getting some clarity at the start about what it is, where our focus is. Then second is to develop your evaluation questions, and so that's where we started today with what are the questions that we have, so that can help focus our inquiry and focus our effort as well. And then we've got to develop these things called criteria, and that's really, the criteria is the word that often gets replaced for what are the values in this context that we need to be able to make an assessment about how valuable something is. Where do we get the values from? How do we develop those criteria? And that we call them criteria here in this kind of step through. And then not only do we need to develop those values, but we need to have a shared understanding about what they look like when they're awesome and when they're not really showing up, or when they're just emerging, to when they might be blossoming and growing beautifully. So we need to have some kind of way, a shared understanding for what those different levels of value might be, so that when we bring our evidence to the table, we can collectively and collaboratively make a judgment that is meaningful, and we can put our hands on our heart and say, yeah, we did a really good job on that thing, but not such a good job on this other thing, because this, when we think about that continuum of value and goodness, actually our evidence suggests that we didn't do quite so well on this other thing. So then we need to, once we've got those things, then we go out and gather our evidence. And the good thing about having step 1 to 3 in your pocket, step 1 to 4 in your pocket, is that it helps you actually decide what kind of evidence you might need and the range of evidence that might be appropriate and credible in the context in which you're working, rather than leaping straight to evidence. If we do step 1 to 4 first, we're in a much better position to think about what's credible and actually reasonable and practical in the context that we're working. So then we can use that evidence to make sense of what's going on and to answer our evaluative questions. And finally, it's how do we share that and to support our claims with our claims of how well we're doing, whether that's with our communities and our whānau who we work with, or whether that's with our funders, our boards, our other parts of our system that we're working to provide that evidence for. And I can't stress enough that one of the ways in which Rach and I have kind of our evaluation practice, these steps need to all be done collaboratively. The question is, in developing those questions and criteria and that rating system is it's important to think about who's in the room, who's at the table, whose values are we deciding are important here, and how are we going to make a judgment that actually holds sway with the people that are important, the people that should be in the room. So thinking about how that can be done, the process of doing this is just as important as the steps.
Right.
Anything else you'd like to add, Rach?
No, I think we're going to try and land this kind of process with you now through sharing some examples of what we're talking about. So I'm going to start us off by sharing an example from the workshop, which is a Wellington-based organisation that focuses on trying to shift mindsets for social change through communicating differently. So they've written a report, and the link is there about measuring their impact. And that report is actually a great example of stepping through that process that Kate's just described in relation to a high level aim. So what they were trying to do was actually shift mindsets to support change around child poverty, child and whānau poverty, and Aotearoa. So it's big, complex stuff. And they wanted to show the connection between, make a line of sight between what they were doing and what their contribution and impact was in that space over 3 years. So in their report, they identify these evaluative questions. So these are the questions that they wanted to answer. To what extent and what ways is our work producing valuable outcomes and impact? So you'll notice the evaluative framing of those questions. What are we learning from the work, from our collaborators as we go, and how are we changing in response to that? So the process that they used, these were their evaluative questions. They then present their intended outcomes, and I'll show you those in a moment. They then assessed progress against those outcomes using a performance and impact framework, and I'll show you that. And then they outline the evidence they used to support their claims for each outcome. So it's a lovely example of just what we're talking about. So they've got their questions. These are the outcomes, the high-level outcomes that they were trying to achieve. So there's a circle here around raising interest, building a research base, helping people to use that and use different narratives to drive public discourse and understanding, to shift mindsets, to shift policy. So it's a big complex loop and set of outcomes that this is really their theory of change around how they believe change will happen around the outside. In the middle here, they've put in there their sort of key assumptions about what will make the biggest difference. That lived experience needs to be in the center. It's a matter of building a movement of people to change the narratives in this space. And it's about building capacity to talk about systems change and social change. So these are the sort of outcomes of their theory of change, how they believed it would happen. Change would happen. And here is their framework that they used to assess progress against those outcomes. So along the bottom here, and I hope you can see this, they're using a growth metaphor with a seed to a plant. And the criteria along the bottom for the seed, if it's not showing, it's not yet emerging, there's no clear evidence yet. And then they gradually work through, there's some evidence to fully grown and flourishing, mature on the right-hand side. So this is an example of a rating system with their clear criteria for each of those ratings up above. They were also really clear about the types of evidence that they use to inform their judgment. So it's not as important, you know, going into depth about what each of these were. The point here is that they used a range of sources of evidence, from feedback from people they were working directly with, public opinion surveys, media, a whole range of they used triangulate and make assessments. And here's an example of, whoops, I can get rid of that. Whoops. Sorry, here's an example of an assessment they made against an outcome. So in terms of raising stakeholder and partner interests, they gave it an assessment of strong growth, and they speak about that. And then they talk to the evidence to support that claim that they're using. So they did that for each of their outcomes. And then they produced this summary for each of those. So in terms of their desired or valued outcomes across the top there, this is the assessment that they gave. Any questions or comments about that example?
Can I jump in, Rach?
Yes.
I think one of the things that this slide in particular demonstrates, and it's been my experience when we use this kind of approach, this much deeper kind of description of the change we want to see and the levels of change, and also where we use multiple sources of evidence to be able to make a claim about how we're doing. When people have been involved in creating that, when they have a stake in this, one of the things that I've seen, and this is a lovely example, is that people don't feel, because they can strongly support their claim of how well they're doing or where they need improvements, they don't feel bad about saying we're just at the new shoot stage. They don't feel bad about saying everyone's not trying to hit strong growth for everything. They actually are much more open to reporting where things are still improving or just getting started, or things are, and you can report why things haven't moved or haven't shifted over a period of time when you revisit this. People feel much more comfortable being really authentic about these judgments when they've been involved in the development of these frameworks. Yeah, so that's the other thing I would say about this. It's a lovely example of a very public report that says, well, we haven't actually done as well as, you know, like we're shooting for this other, we're going for this end, but we're actually still at this beginning new shoot stage.
Mm.
I think the visual depiction is so powerful because so much has to go on under the ground, and so often we get judged for only what shows, and so it's great to show what's not seen. So it's a great visual depiction.
Yes, and just to add as well, in terms of the way that the judgment or the rating system is framed, it's good to use positive framing. So instead of saying there's no evidence here, nothing's gone on, to say it's yet to emerge. Do you know what I mean? So you don't want to be using these to blame or shame or, you know, it's more a kind of honest appraisal based on a range of sources of evidence about how things are going. And
on the other hand, one of the things that we do encourage people to do is you do have to call out when things haven't gone well. So the positive framing, the strengths-based approach to creating scale like this is really empowering, particularly for people working really hard on the ground. And as you say, Maggie, where there's a lot of work going on under the ground that's not visible. And so this is a very empowering kind of approach, but it's still important to call out when things aren't going well. And what we've found is that this kind of approach does allow people to do that, to name when things are not working, and when things are under the line, basically, below the line.
I think also in the social service sector, I work in an agency where we work with children, youth and adults who have experienced sexual violence. And really often, it's a long-term kind of adventure. We're not really going to be around long enough to see the full fruit, but we'll see some progress. And so often it feels like funders are unrealistic about thinking everyone's magically fixed tomorrow. And so just trying to pitch our things into realistic timeframes and, the little germination of change for good. And, perhaps if we had the luxury of going back in 20 years and asked everybody how they were getting on, we would get a different sort of raft of evidence. But it's only because I've been here a really long time, I've seen the children grow up, I see what happens, but that's not usual. So, yeah, understanding that our steps are quite small often.
They are, and I really feel, I really understand your comment too, Diana, about showing yourself in the best light, and the struggle to be able to actually report authentically about how things are going. So sometimes how we share this stuff is important for us to think about. What I've found is that if organisations develop this for themselves in the first instance, they develop this thorough values-based approach, that they can really dig deep internally and have these deep conversations and work well together on how things are going. How they might share that with their funder is another whole question in here. So let's just hold that, but I really feel your pain there.
And just picking up on your point, Valerie, this was probably multi-million-dollar, work. So yes, they would have spent a lot of time and effort and resource putting this together. However, we are going to show you other examples that are, very grassroots, linking to events and specific smaller projects. So we will get to those. Yes. I work a lot in philanthropy. I'm just looking at Diana's point, and my experience is that funders actually really appreciate honesty, and it helps to build trust. If there's usually a good reason why something hasn't worked, and it's refreshing to funders for people to be upfront about that, and it can help build the relationship. I completely understand that people are reluctant to share what hasn't gone well, but that is where often a lot of the learning is, and it's good for funders to know that too. But yes, not easy, and you make your own judgments about that. Okay. I will go back to our... Okay. Kate.
Okay, so this one here is really about saying, for our different evaluative questions that we have, there are a range of different kinds of criteria or values we might use to be able to answer those questions. So if our question is about how much progress have we made, what's the extent of our contribution to this thing, then the criteria that we're going to choose are probably going to be about the distance that people have travelled, the values that we're going to use there about the visibility of the change or the significance of the change for people, their ratings on that significance of change. I think earlier on we had an early a scale that was about feelings, so it might be that kind of thing that we might use. as our criteria. If we're thinking about the quality of our delivery, again, we might, the values that we might, or the criteria that we might use there are feedback from people that we are working with about their satisfaction or their feelings about what we're doing. We might use the strength of something. We can get into more detail about how we might write those criteria, and those criteria can be nice, rich descriptions of these things. They don't just have to be a one-word thing or a measure necessarily, but these are the kinds of criteria that you might think about when you're answering these questions. The value of an outcome or an investment, the extent to which needs have been addressed is something that you might have as your criteria. So it might be, you know, what's really important is that you increase the number or the extent to which needs are being addressed in your community or amongst those that you are with, the value that it's adding, the perceived value of those in your community or program or organisation. So again, these are just ideas for you to play with. The sustainability of an outcome, again, that's short or long-term, depth or surface. So this is just an example of how you might think about answering an evaluative question and the kinds of criteria you might use to answer those questions. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Kate. So now I'm going to talk you through another example. This one's from the work of Jane Davidson, who has a great website called Realist Evaluation or Real Evaluation?
Real Evaluation.
Yeah. She's a New Zealand evaluator based in the States who does fabulous work. And this is kind of her thing, this space here of how to make these evaluative assessments. So her example is an organisation who put on an expo for teenagers on how to be safe with cars. And this is the question that they wanted to answer, their evaluative question. How well did this expo provide people with the knowledge and skills needed to make safer choices, influence their attitudes, belief and intentions about being safe with cars? And along the bottom here is their kind of criteria for how they were going to assess how well they did. So on the left-hand side, you know, and this is, you know, a good example of using your own language for these things. They're like, whoa, you know, we're a long way from where we need to be. There's still considerable risk. We need to work on this. Right to the other end of fantastic. That's the kind of thing that we're shooting for, and we think it will really lead to saving lives. So this is the kind of criteria that they decided that they wanted to use to assess this expo. So how they went about that, they asked young people some key questions in relation to this expo. It's sort of like, before you had this information, what would you have done? And then after you went to the expo, how, you know, what's changed in relation to this? So how often do you make sure you have a safe way of getting home? How's the expo influence that? How often do or will you speak up when you see a friend do something unsafe? So they were looking at distance traveled for people in terms of the information and their experience of the expo and how they feel that will change their behavior. And then they asked people about what they learned at the expo. So this was their kind of rating system. And then they plotted that. So they have their criteria across the top, the key outcomes they wanted along the left here. And then they made an assessment against each of those outcomes based on what young people said at the expo around the distance traveled. So that sort of highlighted where they feel the expo made the most difference and where they feel that they might need to put more effort in terms of knowledge of risk factors. though they say there that wasn't a key focus. But so that's another example, quite a hands-on one around a specific event. Any questions or comments about that? It's a good example of, with your criteria, putting it in language that, makes sense to you. Okay. So Kate's going to take us through a few more examples.
So these are just some examples of developing these both criteria and rating scales, and they're kind of blended in here. And there's different kinds of scales that you can use. You can use a more generic kind of scale, like the ones that the workshop did, where they had very high, like we're using the growth metaphor, and it applied across all of their outcomes. Or you can develop one that's much more descriptive, like this one, with lots of rich description for each level. This was one that we used in a mental health context, and in relation to the housing and accommodation needs and situations of clients. And it was used as part of a self-assessment and planning process that was done with key workers and the individuals themselves. They co-produced the ratings around where they were at together as part of their kind of developing support plans for them as they were working through their journeys. And so this was an example of you can see that these are rich descriptions, and the kind of evidence that you might bring to bear will be all sorts of things. You don't necessarily, it'll be a mix of things when you come together to be able to say whether these things are true or not, and where you might land, and they create the context for rich discussions when you're working at that individual caseworker, support worker kind of level, mental health support worker level, peer support process. Yeah, so this is just an example of, and this was then able to be cascaded up through the organisation and aggregated to be able to create an overview of where clients were at in their organisation and how they were based on their own self-assessment of where they were at, the supported self-assessment. Yeah.
And this kind of scale is really important to social service organisations, isn't it? Where, you're wanting to see where people are at, and you're wanting to track change over time in relation to the work that you're doing to support them. So there's a lot of examples trying to capture people's journey over time based on where they're at, how they're moving, and what's making the difference. I'm just trying to get to the next slide. Here we go. Here's another example.
Okay, so this is another example of a set of criteria, if you like, for a recovery journey and the distance travelled that clients. So you can see that there are two assessments here for clients about at time 1 and time 2, and this was with the same client where we looked at a range of different things. So you can see on there actually the housing continuum, on the housing space that we just showed you the graph for. For this particular person, obviously housing hasn't really changed much from time 1 to time 2. It's still pretty dire, but other things have shifted. And so this is another example. This spider diagram is a nice way, and clients would often, this would be printed out for clients to be able to take home with them for peers and those working in the service. They could print this out, and they could have it to be able to see their own progress, and it would be linked to their own planning. This next example is an old one and a good one. This is from an example of an evaluation piece of work we did with a program called He Oranga Pautama with Sport New Zealand. And so this is there were the development with 12 Māori providers around what does it mean to be developing as Māori in sport and recreation, and 5 dimensions, if you like, emerged as part of that process. And so these were the dimensions that emerged and what they actually mean. And then we used, and they used actually, and we used as part of the evaluation, these dimensions to be able to assess where they were at in terms of that as Māori journey that they were on. Rachel, if you could flip to the next slide. This is the Te Whitu Rehua, which was developed. And so if people were as Māori, they're actually in the centre. So rather than the peak being at the edges, the where they're trying to get to is in the centre of the rehua. And there's a continuum, a 3-point continuum on each of those dimensions. So you can see, for example, that on the width dimension, te reo me ona tikanga, you have total immersion in te reo me ona tikanga in the centre, and then you might have some bilingual, bicultural stuff going on at the second point, and at the first point there, it's te reo me ona tikanga. It's not likely to occur, so it's likely that it's all in English. Is really what's going on there. So there was a continuum on each of those points of the star of the rehua. And this is still being used today. So this was developed a decade ago, more than a decade ago, and still being used today for Māori providers in the funding and the support of their development into the as Māori space in sport and rec. Rach, do you want to just flip to the next slide? For example, netball is an example of mainstream sport which scores a 1 on pretty much all of those dimensions. Now, one of the ways that you might shift from only getting a 1 as opposed to a 3 on all of those 5 dimensions is that it might be that this is Māori netball, and you might actually end up speaking, there may be some bicultural, some more Māori spoken as part of that. It might be a more whānau-centred netball tournament as part of a marae program, or as part of a Power Wars or a marae wars kind of space. And so you can ratchet up some of those dimensions depending on the context in which the sport is taking place. It's probably always going to be a 1 in terms of a traditional sport, but the other dimensions could potentially grow from 1s to 2s or 3s even, depending on how it's played, where it's played, etc. Yeah. Right, next one. Kiorahi, on the other hand, is scores a 15. So kiorahi is a revitalising traditional sport that started, it has been around, pre-contact, but is now played in many schools and on marae and in tournaments across the country. Hundreds of kids are involved in this now. It's a national and international sport. And so these things are now, it's an important part of marae life and revitalisation of the language, and is a Māori controlled sport and rec. So that scores are 15, as you can see, yeah. And now some of those points may drop down, because one of the things that Kiorahi has done is it's actually gone into mainstream schools. So mainstream schools where there are lots of Māori kids, and so some of that Māori language stuff, there's a small amount, there may be some English spoken in those schools, so it's not fully immersed in the reo necessarily, although for some of those kids they're probably learning their reo through the playing of the sport, and they're learning Māori tikanga as well as part of the sport, but that rating may drop to a 2 potentially if it was in a mainstream school, on a sports field in a mainstream school. So this is a nice way of being able to demonstrate how you might use a rating system like that.
I was just thinking about Wakaama, which is where we moved into.
The question by Emon. Emon, I was on the developmental evaluation team in the development of the Te Whetū Rehua, but actually I was very much in a supporting role with two of my colleagues, Nanwehi Peihana and Kataraina Pipi, on this piece of work, but it was actually designed with the communities themselves. So we had 12 Māori communities and sport and rec providers from around the country, and it was designed over the course of a year in Wānanga and on marae with them. So this was a fully designed by Māori, as Māori process as well. I was very much a support player in this process, in this evaluation work.
Okay. Any other questions there?
You can find, and we will put the link. There's actually a lovely little video on the Sport New Zealand website if you wanted to follow that up, of the Te Whetū Rehua and the way in which it's used. If you look for Hewa Rangapoutama on their website, you can find both the evaluation that we did many moons ago, it's still there, and also the little video that's been made of this example. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, so we're just going to pause here, and you will receive these slides, and there will be also some resources with some links to examples. Just wanted to take a few minutes here for you to, by yourself, thinking back to what you wanted to evaluate and the key evaluative questions that you had. What kind of criteria and rating system would respond well to those? We've got an example here. Like if you're wanting to evaluate contribution to your strategic plan, you might think about how much resource and effort you'd applied in different towards different outcomes, the level of evidence you've got and range of evidence in terms of contribution to each outcome. And in terms of a rating system, I'm just sharing one here from Penny Hagan at the Southern Initiative. The Wi-Fi signal is quite a nice one. If you've got full Wi-Fi, you're making a great contribution. Yes, so that's an example there. So just take a few minutes for yourself. If you have questions or comments, put them in the chat and we will come back to those. So just maybe 3 or 4, 5 minutes.
Kia ora. Eamon here. I've got a question. I think I know the answer to it, but I thought I'd just double check. So don't just take these example questions as purely examples. So the first one being, to what extent has Te Kete Hononga improved systems efficiency? And the second question being, what value has Te Kete Hononga created for its users? How and to what extent? Is it appropriate to have different rating systems? Thinking about to what extent the first question has Te Kete Hononga improved efficiency, that might be a distance traveled one. So you get a baseline starting point, and then at the end of it, you can see, oh, you know, it's improved by this much. The second one might be more aligned to the growth example of the seed germinating, in terms of flourishing value. My assumption is that you need a consistent rating system. So you can't use 2 different ones for different questions, but that is the question.
Are you happy for me to jump in, Rach? Yeah, so you're right. They sound really different, but actually you could use the same rating system, but describe the different levels in slightly different ways for the questions. The distance traveled is actually the measures that you might use for the efficiency piece. So you might use a measure that's about distance traveled, but the way you might describe what the different efficiencies look like at different levels might still have a 5-point scale like the growth model, or a it might still have 5 levels or ratings of efficiency. So you could use it in that way, and you could say, if we were kicking it out of the park, if we were awesome, that the distance we'd hope people will have travelled will be at least this far. If we're just in that emerging space, we wouldn't expect to see much distance travelled by those that we're still building our efficiency, and we're hoping that those gains will come in time. So you might describe efficiency in those different ways. And then the second question, again, you might then just describe it in those 5 levels. So the distance travelled is the concept of the change that you might be wanting to see, and you might use it as a measure, but you could use the same 5-point scale. Sometimes it is worth. Sometimes you can split the rating scales, depending. One of the things that we find is the growth model doesn't always work for every context. It's not as cut and dried for some folks. They like something a little bit more cut and dried. And also the growth model, someone else mentioned it before, is that very often sometimes people feel like they're never going to be in the flowering stage. It's going to take 35 years before that happens, and so they'll never reach that. And so sometimes that growth model might not work for them. They might want something where they can hit a high point earlier and create a different kind of scale. So it just depends. And sometimes you've just got to try this out and have a go and adapt it as you go. These scales are not meant to be fixed and rigid either. They're meant to be quite dynamic. So you might try something for a year, or you might give it a go and describe those levels and richness and have everybody on board. What's important is that everybody's clear about we're all on the same page about what our performance, what our different levels are, and what we're trying to shoot for. And then when we come together to assess our evidence, well, where are we on this, and does this still work? And actually, maybe we're shooting too high on that description. We need to pull that back, or so this can be quite dynamic, and it should be, because the world isn't static.
It does come down to what works for you and what makes sense and what reflects what's important to the people that you're working with, and is clear, as you say, Kate. Tracy's got a question.
Thank you.
Sorry. Tracy's got a question about the number of values that are used in rating scales. That's an interesting one, because you often find if you've only got 3, people, on a 3-point scale, people want to go 2.5 or 1.5 if you've got 1 to 10, So that could also be in the category of trying it out. And a neutral response is okay. Some people aren't sure, they don't know, or, a bit kind of, they are neutral. So, that's all right. It's trying to find that sweet spot between not enough, values that people can use, or, and too many. So people often use a 5-point scale, but also in really complex situations, you may want to show that complexity through the kind of scale that you use. You could use the garden metaphor with a bit more richness, for example.
In the Ngāi Tahu work we're doing, we have a 5-point, we're using the growth model as well. They've developed it into something called the tupu model. And what inside the organisation, what we've been working with each of the teams around is they've described both ends and the middle. So they're describing tahua and the bottom end and the middle, and we're leaving Te Pūaha and Te Pūaha, we're leaving them blank. And the reason for that is because we're still in that development mode. So there are two reasons to leaving them blank, is that in the real world, when you gather your evidence together, if you've only got the three described richly, when you gather your evidence together, then it's easier to be able to place yourself on the scale, because you might find yourself feeling like you're not at the lower end of that growth model, but you haven't yet quite reached the middle. But so you're quite happy to land on Te Pūaha or one of those other levels, because you're somewhere in the middle there. You're somewhere in that middle, but you don't have to describe it richly, because it's too complex to try and get all the descriptions of each level written. And there's so much grey in the work that people are doing. And so we've encouraged people to leave those middle ones blank, but to still hold on to the 5 levels, so that they can be dynamic and flexible in their ratings and not have to nail down too much detail in really complex programs. Yeah.
How did people find that process of developing criteria and a rating system? Did you find it easy, straightforward? You can put in the chat how it went.
If it's any comfort to some of you who might be struggling and finding this hard, it is hard. This is the hard thinking stuff. This is the, you've heard about fast and slow thinking. This is the slow thinking stuff, where we have to take some time and we have to get into that harder space. We can't just whip it out generally. It's often quite a tough thing to do. And it's better to do it with more heads around the table too. So if you're doing it, you're finding it a lonely, difficult exercise, that's okay. We usually do it with more people around the table. So that, and the other reason to have more people around the table is that you get people's buy-in to what your organisation or your project thinks is valuable, and what those different levels are. So everyone's on the same page about that.
Yeah, it's just quite a bit of feedback on the importance of doing this with other people. I'm just going to, we've got a summary slide here. This is what we're trying to get to. Is this me or you, Kate?
Oh, I don't think it matters.
Yeah. Who knows? But we can, maybe I'll talk to it and you can add if you like. So we are trying to get past just describing what you did to how well and to the value arising from it. It is important to get the right people together to identify what you need to know, how you might assess that, and what kind of rating system would work in your space, and to do that assessment together. This isn't something that someone should sit in and do by themselves. Ideally, you want to involve not just your team and your board about what does amazing look like, but the people that you're working with. And, ideally, that should be what this is built around. What does amazing or good look like to the people that you're supporting or working with? It is an iterative thing. Try some things out, see how it lands with people. Does it make sense? It's helpful in terms of being able to visualize progress and change instead of reports or lots of text. If you can, for example, say to the communities that you're working with, using that growth metaphor, this is where we feel we're getting growth and traction. Here's where we feel we need to do some more work. That's a lot easier for them to get their head around and go, well, yes, or, as a basis for discussion. we've mentioned it is important, the language that you use around this criteria and assessment. Some people talk about having ladders of change or talking about strength of contribution instead of rating scale. And you've noticed that we've carefully avoided using the term rubric, but I have thrown that in at the end. But it is really just a rating system that we're talking about, an assessment process of what good or value looks like. Kate, do you want to add anything there?
I guess what I'd say is one of the benefits of this process that we've seen is, I don't know how many of you have got stuck in the land of KPIs and targets, and have to report on a KPI with a single measure, and how dissatisfying that might be in terms of your feeling about whether that represents the value that you actually have created or are creating in your organisation. And that's one of the very common stories that we hear, is that single measure, that KPI, that target doesn't capture the complexity and the richness of the work that's going on in an organisation. Or for people that, especially in really complex situations, and often the choosing of targets and measures is done because it can be measured, and it's something, sometimes people choose a target that's too hard, or they choose one that's easy to get, depending on the stakes and how much is at stake with getting that target or not. And so that doesn't actually really end up helping anybody. Nobody's any better off as a result of meeting a target necessarily. So one of the ways that this system, this way of thinking about evaluation, is it increases the richness by which we describe what it is we're doing. So the validity is actually higher because it actually does represent more fully the world in which we're working in, and you can talk about the value in much richer ways. So the validity of it is much higher, especially to those on the ground. But we have found that if you can visualise results in this way for funders, they too actually respond in a much more positive way than to a bunch of KPIs being met or not, because actually there's no detail under any of those either. It's, they can't get in underneath those KPIs often, and they can feel meaningless.
Yes, a lot more powerful to say, this is what we believe good looks like, this is how we're going against that, this is how we are evidencing that, and it's a basis for a lot richer discussions, and gives a fuller picture of impact and value. Any final questions?
Yes, Amon's got one there, Rach.
Sorry. Hi. Great question. Do you want to pick that up, Kate? I mean, you've worked a lot on SES.
Yeah, well, I've been fortunate to be in the room while Katarina has facilitated SES on a number of occasions, and she's the founder of this wonderful tool. And I guess one of the things that SES is a tool for gathering evidence. For me, it's a tool for describing the success that's happened and the evidence they have for that success and the strategies they've used. So in many ways, it can be used as a way of gathering evidence for your evaluation, and certainly, so it's not the full evaluation framework, but it's a very deeply empowering process for communities to gather up the things that they think have been successful and why they think so, or why they think that. So it gives you that rich evidence base to be able to use in your evaluation. That often has the voice of community embedded in it, because people have all been involved in gathering that stuff up. And it gives you clues into the evidence that they are using, the vast varieties of evidence that's out there, of different kinds. Yeah, so I've found SES is a really powerful tool to lay down the evidence base for an evaluation.
And yes, a few weeks ago, we went through that tool as part of the first session in this series. So if anyone wasn't there and wants to have a look at that, go to the Centre for Social Impact website. Okay, we've just got one more thing that we want to ask you. I've just put in the chat a link to a question. So we're really interested to see what you will take forward from today, or how you might apply what we've shared. So I just invite you to click on that link and take a moment to share that with us. And I'm going to share that on our screen. Here we are.
And while you're doing that, I'll just respond to Irene, which is thanks for sharing that. What you wrote down at the beginning wasn't as evaluative as you thought it was until you got to the end. And so, yeah, sometimes these things take a bit of time to frame up and to make sure that you've nailed that evaluative question. But thanks for sharing your experience of what you do at the beginning, and then realizing, oh, maybe it wasn't as evaluative as I thought it was at the beginning. So yeah, really appreciate you sharing that experience. None of these things are that easy. If it was easy, I think for sure this would be commercialised in the private sector. But it's this stuff's really hard because it actually gets to the heart of what people value. It is tough, but these are tools and ways of being able to work in ways that, you know, we've found that it's much more empowering and much more centered.
And it seems like the examples are useful for people. So they'll be in the slides that you'll get, and we can also point you to some other examples and useful websites on this. Okay, thank you, everyone. Unless there's any other final questions or comments, I will pass back to Karania to close our session.